Today, we're going to take a look at a piece of animation from Sora no Oto, or Sound of a Sky. I just finished watching this the other day and it's real good. Maybe not an all-time classic exactly. It has some distinct and interesting persistent flaws, but it's one of those shows that kind of reminds me why I'm glad anime is a thing. It paints a certain kind of aesthetic to tell a certain kind of story that you just never see anywhere else. The staff which executed on those ideas may be people you're familiar with. A1 Pictures is credited with production, which means that this anime and its staff are part of the greater Aniplex co-prosperity sphere. You see these people show up all over the place on Aniplex projects. They work with Chef, they work with Trigger, they worked, past tense, with Gainax while they were still relevant. You can find them wherever Aniplex has its hands, which is very wide swaths of the anime industry in 2020, which is part of why I call them the greater Aniplex co-prosperity sphere. Anyway, to give you a sense of what this staff is capable of, most of them will show up a year later alongside a lot of former Gainax employees on The Idolmaster. As you might expect then, this show moves pretty well. It's not really a Sakuga show, but it's almost never totally dead and there's lots of interesting highlights. These highlights are nonetheless infrequent enough that they can still catch your eye. This is one from the very end of episode 6, which is a pretty good episode. It's about how the Helvetian military has a volunteer army that they don't bother to actually fucking pay for some reason, and how therefore the monarchy will fall to a military coup within a decade, probably. Also, Kanada helps an orphan, and we get Tsuyu in a suit. Like I said, good episode. So let's just let this scene play once, so that we can get a sense of what it's like in context.
みんなもう入ってるぞ。
はい、すぐ行きます。お疲れですね。
ああ、できれば髪を洗うのも避けたかったんだが、いろいろあってな。はいはいはい。
じゃあ先輩、私に髪拭かせてください。一度触ってみたかったんです。
結局イルカは買わなかったのか。自分へのご褒美はあれだと思ってたんだが。
リオ先輩は運命って信じます？
なんだ唐突に。
なんかね、今日そう思えることがあったんです。自分へのご褒美はそれでお腹いっぱいになりました。
私は信じないな。最初から決められたり与えられたりするのは大嫌いなんだ。ただそうだな、誰かの生み出した偶然が巡り巡って他人の人生を大きく変えることはあるのかもしれない。
So that's a pretty good scene. It's not Sora no Oto at its deepest, frankly, but I think this is a much more reasonable way to frame a discussion of fate than the namby-pamby shit most media pulls. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about animation, so what do we think? This definitely isn't Yuki Komatsu's work. He worked on this episode, this isn't him. There's nothing delicate or fine about this animation. In fact, I'd say that honestly, the word that I would use to describe parts of this is kinda brutal. That sounds like a criticism, and yeah, sure, in an ideal world, this scene would probably look a little bit better, but let's take a closer look. The cut begins with Private Sorami writing something and Sergeant Major Kazumiya walking in from the left side of a composition. I'd like to take a second to note Private Sorami's hand movements. Actually, I'd like to note two things about them. First, that they're animated at all. It's a nice touch, I like it. Second, that she appears to actually be scribbling on the table. However, since this is an armored platoon under the army and not the Marines, I'm pretty sure that this is not in fact characterization and is in fact a layer mismatch problem. We're about to see another, in fact. The Sergeant Major walks in while drying her hair, which is a decently complicated motion, wraps the towel around her neck, and then stops on a hold. Her hair continues to move for a few frames afterward. It feels kind of weird how her walking motion and her drawing motion stop on the same frame, but I expect that's just another expediency of production. Next, she pulls the chair out very carefully from the table. Again, it's actually kind of rough the way this moves. The Sergeant Major's feet slide along the ground, especially her left leg as she steps back with her right on the last stride. It reminds me a little bit of how some video game animations need to cheat a little bit to get objects into the right position. As you've probably also noticed by now, there's another layer problem with Sergeant Major Kazumiya's right leg conflicting with the chair this time. Now, I just pointed out 3 problems with this animation, so you might be wondering what I'm doing. I did pick this cut for a reason, and that reason was not to make fun of it. First of all, when it comes to animation, sometimes it really is the thought that counts. For an ordinary character interaction like this, the fact that the animator chose to make something move is sometimes as important, if not more important, than how well it moves in actuality. I think the fact that we do see Kanata writing and Ryo drawing her hair and carefully pulling out the chair adds to the scene's overall sense of reality more than any jankiness might detract from it. This sense of reality within the context of a fantasy setting is actually one of director Mamoru Kanbei's stated goals, so little bits like this are important. In that light, you could say that so far what I've been praising is the layout work, not the Genga. This still might sound like I'm damning it with faint praise, and that's not my intention, so let's move on, because this next part's real nice. So, having pulled out the chair, the Sergeant Major collapses into it falling sideways, which... mood, honestly. There's a cut, like film editing kind of cut, to a new composition with Sergeant Major Kazumiya in profile. This is probably the nicest and most sophisticated part of the cut. There are 4 motions here, that's how I would break it down. First, Ryo falls backwards. Then she adjusts herself forward in her seat. Then she relaxes back in her chair. And then she puts her right leg up. All 4 of these motions are led into with very fast timing. Here's the spacing when she starts to shift, really more like throw her weight forward after falling back. Here's the spacing when she starts to lean back. And then here's the spacing on the second frame that we see her leg come up and she kicks back. That's pretty aggressive timing. This is accentuated by some secondary motion of the Sergeant Major's towel, hair, bell, and shirt. As a result, the motion is very bouncy. It feels like somebody aggressively getting comfortable. You've seen this kind of movement, right? You've seen somebody sit down in a chair like this. You might have sit down in a chair like this yourself sometimes. This feels very real to me. Charismatic is an adjective often used to describe animation, but in this case I feel relatable hits closer to the truth. This is relatable animation. So, while Ryo is talking, she takes a few different poses and does a nice idle hairbrushing gesture. It's nothing too fancy, but I like them because they're very Kazumiya-rashi. They have a certain Ryo-ness to them. Sora no Oto takes a good stab at giving its characters their own mannerisms beyond the usual anime-isms, and with Ryo, they probably succeed more than with any of the others. That might be because they succeed with Ryo as a character more than any of the others. In theory, I would say that every single one of Sora no Oto's characters, everybody in the cast, is well developed and distinct. They are conceptually quite good. In practice, they are inconsistent, and they're inconsistent from top to bottom, from writing all the way down to animation. So, complete vertical, everything that you would consider as part of characterization is inconsistent. Ryo is not the best character per se, but she is, in my opinion, the most consistently written, acted, and, as we're seeing here, animated. And compare this to what happens next, when Kanata gets to her feet and starts waving her hand like she wants the teacher to gall on her, and starts talking about how she's always wanted to feel up her platoon sergeant's hair. From what I understand, they captured exactly the right amount of gayness for off-duty tank crew. But anyway, yeah, that's what Private Sorami does. She waves her hand around like she wants the teacher to call on her. There's a fair bit of squash and stretch going on here to accentuate that, too. See how her mouth is open to the fullest extent while her arm is also at its furthest extent. And how when her mouth is closed, her body is in its relaxed state. This is nice looking animation, but it's also animation that you could transpose onto Haruka Amami from The Idolmaster, or Ohana Matsumae from Hanasaku Iroha, or really almost any lead girl from a turn-of-a-decade Bisoujo Zoo. This may be readily excused because very often you could also transpose her personality onto them. However, I do not intend in any way to resurrect the hoary old arguments about whether character animation in anime is overly reliant on cliché, because first of all, my criticism is much more holistic of Sora no Oto. This is not an observation about anime as a whole, this is specifically about how things work in Sora no Oto, and because it falls well outside of the scope of this video. But I do like it. Anyway, next we see that the good Sergeant Major has taken up Private Sorami's offer. I really like this depiction of wet hair. It clumps together in thick parts suggested by shadows and highlights, with one or two strands that appear lighter standing out towards the side of Ryo's head. I love how the hair naturally flows inward, right? When Kanata moves her hands backwards, even after her hands stop for a moment. It's just the natural falling of the hair inward because of gravity. And let's just say it, Ryo being pretty and having nice hair is also one of her character traits. This is anime we're talking about. You have to always remember this. And Kanata was just talking about how she'd always wanted to feel it, and now we can see why. I don't have all that much more to say about this cut. There's a little bit of weirdness going on with how Kanata's arm interacts with the held part of her body, but by now you should get the idea that the drawings are not particularly solid in this cut, and there's some weird stuff going on. We get to see a few nice expressions though, as Kanata and Ryo talk about the concept of fate. Kanata's expressions here are a bit more in line with how the show tends to animate her when they aren't falling back on more pure stock archetypes. For a conversation scene, there's a decent bit of movement here. Like I said, A for effort. So, that brings us to the question though. Who do we got to thank for this? Whose cut is this? Sakaguboru has it tagged as artist unknown, but I actually think we can make a pretty good guess. I suggest that this is the work of Yuusuke Tanaka. Tanaka Yusuke. He's a prolific member of the Aniplex Co-Prosperity Sphere, and you've probably seen his work elsewhere as well. He's been on Gurren Lagann, Sayonara Zetsubo Sensei, 2009 Full Metal Alchemist, Black Rock Shooter, every Idolmaster anime starting with 2011 one, Fate Grand Order Babylonia. Man, he's been around. So here's what the Sakuga at Wiki has to say about him. It's not much, but it does have a little bit of a blurb. A graduate of a Yoyogi Animation School Fukuoka branch, ? He's participated as main staff on productions led by A1 Pictures from 2010 to the present day. He was in charge of initial character design on the Idolmaster Side M in 2017. There's no doubt that his recognition of women anime fans has risen. So, hold up a minute. That's kind of an odd claim, right? There's no doubt that his recognition of women anime fans has risen. So, what exactly are they talking about? His designs for Side M, which are some very pretty boys, did win a popularity poll for New Type magazine, so clearly he's doing something right, but as far as I'm aware, he hasn't designed or really even animated a whole lot of pretty boys either before or since then. Has he been an outspoken feminist on Twitter and I didn't notice? I don't know. It's weird. Seriously, if any of you guys have any insight into this, any of you guys got deets on whether Sakuga at Wiki is talking shit or whether there's something to this, let me know. Anyway, what's my argument that this is the guy? Well, it mostly comes down to the timing. The fast in timing and his use of hold looks a lot like his character animation that we do have attributed to him. Here's a recent example from Fate Grand Order Babylonia. And before I go on with this, I am more confident in my diagnosis that this is the correct animator than I am that I've got the Fate characters correct. Legitimately. If I get any of these wrong, I'm sorry. Anyway, so first of all, check how Ushiwakamaru slides into place here. She starts off sliding fairly slow, but then makes this big dramatic move towards Master. Here's what the spacing looks like for that. She stops fairly abruptly on a hold when the motion is done. It seems like a similar mentality to how we just saw Dio animated. Merlin putting back his beverage is another good example from the same scene. At least I think it is. It's bouncy in the same sort of way, how he comes back then forward. As for other points of comparison, it's hard to compare the drawings themselves because the Sora no Oto episode was AD'd by someone else. The Fate examples are closer to Tanaka-san's native style because he AD'd that episode himself, also because the designs are quite different and because, frankly, my Sakugam is pretty weak. There's also the possibility that the Sora no Oto cut is multiple animators, I don't know. It just seems like among the people who worked on episode 6, the case is strongest for Yuusuke Tanaka doing most of it, but maybe some of you have a better idea. That's all I've got to say about this piece of animation, though it might not be all I have to say about Sora no Oto in general. I haven't decided exactly what I want to do next, but I think I'll try for a bi-weekly pace. But that's all for now. Stay safe out there.